The reading of REKLAW RIA, fantasy novel written by Melody Rogers Stegaheis, read by Melody Rogers Stegaheis. Prologue. "Oh, it's beautiful, Mama," Em breathed as she gazed at the necklace in her mother's hand. "Here, let me put it on for you," her mother said as she clasped it around her neck. Em's dark eyes misted over as she moved her hair out of the way. "It's the most beautiful present ever. Thank you. Thank you both," she sighed. "Well, happy birthday then. I, have to get to work on that broken fence out back, so, her father stammered, a bit embarrassed. "Ma and I are going berry picking. I'll pick some extra sweet ones just for you, Pa," Em said, as she stood on tiptoe and kissed her father's cheek. Her father's face turned bright pink as he made a hasty exit out the door. Em and her mother giggled like schoolgirls as they made their way into the woods. They gossiped about this and that and told silly jokes as they wandered around picking raspberries here and blueberries there. They were having so much fun they had spent almost the entire day away from home. "We really should get back," her mother said, "before your father thinks we ran off or something." Neither of them noticed how quiet it was as they walked through the field toward home, nor did they notice the darkness that surrounded them. A sudden wicked wind kicked up around them, sending their hair flying into their faces. Em's mother was knocked to the ground, blood pooling around her. Em felt a crushing weight around her middle and screamed as she was lifted from the ground. Her father arrived at the field in time to see large wings flying toward the mountains and to hear his daughter's terrified screams echoing back to him on the wind. "No!" he screamed, helpless to do anything. His wife's body lay in a heap a few yards away. He prayed that she had only fainted, but the blood told him different. He let out a sobbing gasp as he turned her over. Her neck and chest were gashed wide open. Blood covered her face and soaked her dress. Her head flopped forward toward him, bringing her dead eyes around to stare directly at him. "Oh!" he cried as he cradled her in his arms and sobbed, "No! No! No!" into her bloody hair. He rocked her back and forth, cradling her like a baby. His life was over. Everything he had ever loved was gone. His beautiful wife, his precious daughter, gone. His mind snapped as he racked his wife's body. "I'll kill it," he mumbled. "I'll kill it." His eyes blazed and he brought his head up to stare at the horizon. "I'll kill you! I'll kill you!" he screamed. "Mark my words, I'll kill you all." Chapter 1. Special. The village of Dolan was nestled in a small valley not far from the Caledon River. Fed by the Kansora mountain range far to the north, the Caledon ran cold and deep, bringing life of all shapes and sizes to the valley and to the forests that surrounded it. Life, although not easy, was peaceful. Well, most of the time. The Beckwith farm was anything but peaceful this morning. Even the morning mists of early April seemed to run from the sounds that came from the dimly lit barn. A lantern flickered softly over a work table against the back wall where an old man labored over his work and a dark-haired little girl watched, her attention glued on what was happening. The squawks, squeals, and screams of a young red-tailed hawk echoed through the barnyard as the little blighter literally tried to bite the hand of salvation. "Hold still, you little beggar," Colin Beckwith growled as he again tried to wrap the young hawk's broken wing. He had found the young bird earlier that morning as he had been inspecting his fences. He suspected that the fledgling had been pushed from the nest by a sibling. Unable to fly, the poor little thing had broken his wing when he hit the ground. Colin had brought it home with all good intentions, but now he wasn't so sure. "Poor little thing, my foot," he scoffed. "He bites like a rabid griffin and screams like a harpy." "Hold still," he growled again as he pulled his finger away, just in the nick of time. Beckwith's 6-year-old granddaughter, Drianna, watched all this from the stool close by, her liquid blue eyes growing wide with surprise as her papa's fingers narrowly escaped the bird's beak once again. "He's scared, Papa, and doesn't understand what you're doing," the little girl said softly. "I know, child. I wish someone could tell the little beggar I'm only trying to help," he said gently. "Let me try, Papa," Drianna said. Colin hid a smile as the little girl began to chirp and coo, as if trying to talk to the bird. To his utter amazement, the bird seemed to be listening. The fledgling settled down and turned its golden eyes toward the girl, staring straight into her eyes. In a moment, the bird completely relaxed and let Colin wrap his injured wing without further complaint. With that done, he placed the bird in a small wooden box on the floor and turned to his granddaughter, asking in a quiet wonder, "What did you say to him, little one?" "I told him what you said, Papa," she said matter-of-factly, "that you were just trying to help him and that you would never hurt him." Colin shook his head in amazement and turned toward the door. "Well, sweetheart, I guess we better get back to the house before your Mama Belle wonders what happened to us." "Papa, may I stay and talk to him for a little while?" Drianna asked as she jumped from the stool to walk over to the box where the bird lay quietly. Not knowing what to think, Colin just nodded his head and said, "Only for a few minutes. He needs his rest." He watched from the door as Drianna knelt at the box and began to click and coo. The old man could hardly believe it when the bird answered with its own clicks and coos. Shaking his head once, he stepped into the morning light. He stretched his long, lean body and looked around his home. At 57, Colin Beckwith had the build of a much younger man. He was tall and strong, with broad shoulders and a lean torso. The only thing that gave away his age were the wrinkles around his gray eyes and the salt and pepper color of his hair and beard. The old man looked around his home with pride. The thatched roof cottage was small but comfortable and well kept. It had 2 small bedrooms, a stone fireplace, which kept it warm and cozy. The barn and other outbuildings were strongly built, and the land he owned had strong wooden fences. Oak and maple trees surrounded the area, as well as a few pine and poplar trees. A large apple tree hung over a fence to the right side of the house, its blooms in full bloom, filling the air with the sweet scent of spring. A cow mooed softly from the small corral, and chickens pecked the ground in front of the barn. Going to the well that stood in the center of the yard, he hauled up a bucket and took it to the watering trough. He gave the cow a gentle pat on the shoulder. "There you go, old girl," he said gently. Walking back to the house, he couldn't help but smile. All in all, he felt he had done well by Belle, his wife of 30 years. Thinking of her made him feel warm all over. She was a woman for me then, and will be for the next 30 years, he thought as he headed for the house. Reaching for the door latch, he heard the pleasant sound of his wife's humming as she worked around the kitchen. The smell of freshly baked bread and bacon and eggs filled his nose as he opened the door. "Breakfast smells wonderful, and you look beautiful," he said in a warm tone. Belle spun around with a start. She was of a slight build, barely reaching Colin's chin. Small and thin, she had not changed much at all in 30 years. The thick blonde hair braided down her back had only the slightest hint of gray. The warm look in her husband's eyes made her blush slightly. Even after 30 years, he had a way of making her feel like a silly young girl. A broad smile spread across Colin's face. He loved when she blushed like that. Her blue eyes twinkled, and her nose wrinkled as she smiled back at him. "Breakfast will get cold if you don't shut the door and go wash your hands, my love," she said with a hint of laughter in her voice. Colin quickly shut the door and headed for the wash basin in the corner of the room. "Where is our little one?" she asked, his back as he poured wash water. "She is in the barn talking to a bird," her husband laughed. At that moment, Juliana burst into the room with a brilliant smile lighting up her chubby little face. "Good morning, Mama," she chimed and ran to the wash basin. With a little splashing and giggling, Papa Colin and Juliana washed for breakfast. After everyone was seated at the table in the center of the room, Belle served a wonderful meal, all the while listening to Juliana babble about what the little bird had told her. "Papa, you were right about him being pushed from his nest," she blurted out excitedly. "Talon said that—" "Talon?" Papa asked. "Yes, Papa, that's his name. He says his mama called him that because he tore through his eggshell like paper." "Isn't that something?" she breathed. "He said his older brother pushed him from the nest after they fought over a piece of meat." "Papa, Talon wants to know when he can go home again." Juliana took a quick swallow of her milk and waited patiently for an answer. Colin looked up from his breakfast with shock and amusement mixed on his face. "Tell him that he can go home after his wing heals," he answered, patting her dark, curly, wavy curls. Belle had been listening to everything her granddaughter said, without saying a word. "Finish your breakfast, little one, and I will go visiting," she said. "Would you like that?" Juliana smiled brightly and began eating her breakfast quickly. About 1 month later, Papa Colin removed the bandages from the young bird's wing, setting him free. Talon took flight with ease and circled the farm several times before settling down on a pile of wood near the barn. Juliana would never forget the golden eyes that stared into hers that day. Talon told her that he thought of her as his sister and that he would protect her always, giving his life if need be. From that day on, he was never far from her side, and she loved him as her best friend. She never thought of him as a pet or a toy. He was as wild and free as any bird could be. Yet their bond was one that could and would never be broken. From the start, they had come to an understanding. Talon would not hunt while she was near because, although she knew that living and dying were all part of nature's design, it still hurt her to think of any animal having to die. Talon had understood that immediately and had always done his hunting well away from Juliana's sensitive heart. As Mama Belle watched Juliana's relationship with the bird grow, she knew her husband never would really believe in the little girl's gift. But she did. She knew that her beautiful little granddaughter was indeed very special. Her sweet little Dree had a unique gift. She could speak to and understand the creatures of the forest. Chapter 2. Sweet 16 Interrupted. The sun burst over the peaceful valley and chased the mists of morning away. Everything seemed serene and quiet, all except at the Beckwith farm, which had been a bustle of activity for some time. There was no time to waste. Today was a special day indeed. Today, Drianna Beckwith turned 16. Everyone in the village was invited to the celebration later in the day. There was so very much to do. Belle Beckwith practically flew around the kitchen, stirring this and tasting that. She had sent her husband outside long ago to set up tables and benches. Belle smiled to herself, knowing it had been really too early for such things, but it had gotten him from under her feet. Colin had not protested to the early hour, and had done what she had asked without question. He truly is a wonderful man, Belle thought, and smiled again. Dree stepped from the small room off the side of the kitchen. She was wearing the new dress Mama Belle had made for her. As Belle looked up from her cooking pot, her breath caught in her throat. Her Drianna was a sight to behold. Her long black hair hung to her waist in gentle waves. A wreath of baby's breath was nestled softly on her head and framed her face beautifully. The white muslin dress hung to her ankles and fit perfectly in all the right places. The sleeves bellowed down her arms and gathered at her wrist with a white silk ribbon. Her Papa Colin had made her a pair of white calfskin slippers to match, and Belle had added ribbon to them as well. Drianna's tan skin seemed to glow behind the fabric, giving her the look of an angel. "Oh, child, you look radiant," Belle said, caressing Dree's cheek. Dree beamed like sunshine and spun around in a little dance. As if on cue, Colin opened the door and stopped dead in his tracks. All he could do was stare at the vision that met his eyes. His little girl had grown into the most beautiful young woman he had ever seen. He was so proud at that moment. He could find no words to speak. Just then a flurry of feathers and noise burst into the room above Colin's head. It fluttered around the room and settled on the back of a chair with a very loud squawk. Talon ruffled his feathers, looked Drianna up and down, and began to chirp softly. "Well, thank you, kind sir," Dree said with a low curtsy. In a matter of seconds, Belle came around the table, swinging her dish towel wildly. "Get out of the house, you little beggar!" she yelled. "Shoot! Shoot!" Talon dodged the towel and squawked loudly at her. "Aw, Mama, Talon just wanted to see my new dress and tell me how pretty I look," Drianna laughed. "Child, you know that I don't want that critter in my house," she huffed, swinging the towel with a vengeance. She barely missed the bird as he flew towards the window, squawking and chirping loudly. Drianna burst into a fit of laughter as she watched the chaos. "What did that little beggar have to say?" Belle asked rather indignantly, as she straightened her apron with a jerk. "You really don't want to know," Dree said through her laughter. Colin, who had not left the doorway, was hard-pressed not to laugh himself. But the dish towel was still in Belle's hand, and he knew it would swing his way if he did. Clearing his throat, he asked his flustered wife what was next on the list to do. Looking up at her husband's face and seeing the laughter he could barely contain, Belle began to chuckle and say, "Oh, that blasted bird!" In saying this, the kitchen erupted into sweet, hearty laughter. Belle gave Colin his next task, which was to cut wood for a bonfire, then shooed Rihanna off out of the way by sending her to the meadow to gather wildflowers to place on the tables. With a determined huff, Belle began to fuss and flutter around her kitchen once again. Dree grabbed a large basket and strolled out the door, closing it gently behind her. Belle looked up at the sound and sighed. She let her mind wander back to a cold night 16 years earlier. Although Colin and Belle loved Rihanna as only grandparents could, she was not their true grandchild. On that cold night so long ago, a young woman had stumbled out of the woods and into the Beckwith's door. She was half frozen and ready to give birth at any moment. Belle and Colin had taken the woman in and did everything they could to save her. Sadly, after giving birth to a baby girl, the woman passed away peacefully. They didn't even know her name. It was decided that the Beckwiths would adopt the child as their granddaughter, with the strict understanding that no one in the village tell anyone the truth until she was old enough to understand. Belle sighed again as she realized that day was fast approaching. Dree strolled down the wagon trail that led into the village, swinging the basket by her side. She knew why her Mama Belle had sent her to the meadow on the other side of the village proper. Wildflowers wasn't it. Mama had only wanted to get Dree out of the house and out of the way. She didn't mind being sent away because it was an absolutely beautiful day, full of promise and joy. The trees created a canopy of dappled green above her head, and the birds sang lovely little tunes from their branches. Dree smiled and twisted around and around on the path, her giggles sounding just like bird songs. A gentle breeze blew through the trees, sending leaves dancing across the pebbles of the path. Sunlight streamed through the leaves like bright little beams. Butterflies and bees floated and zipped around the wildflowers that grew in patches under the trees. Joanna's heart danced, much like the leaves. Her feet barely touched the ground as she floated down the path, happy and excited about what lay ahead of her this day. She heard the whisper, soft beat of wings and little clicks and chirps coming up behind her. Talon gave a little squawk as he glided to a low branch just ahead of her. As Dree looked up at him, Talon began to chirp and squawk rapidly. Now, Dree scolded, you shouldn't say such things about Mama Belle. You know the rules as well as I do. No critters in the house. At the word critter, Talon ruffled his feathers and squawked loudly. I know you're not a critter, my friend, but rules are rules. You were asking for it swooping into the house that way. You're lucky Mama didn't grab the broom, Dree laughed. Talon squawked even louder and cocked his head to one side, and turning away and muttering a few quiet clicks. He took flight and glided in the air ahead of her. Dree chuckled to herself, knowing that was as close to an apology as Talon was ever going to give. Dree watched as Talon glided effortlessly through the air. The sunlight coming through the trees sent red and gold sparks across his outstretched wings and down his lean, muscular body. He is such a beautiful fellow, she thought. Several yards up the path, Talon lit upon a branch high atop a pine tree and stared at the ground with growing interest. As Dree approached the base of the tree, she heard quite the ruckus. Suddenly, two little chipmunks burst from the underbrush and raced across the path in front of her, the first with a big acorn in its mouth, the other hot on his heels. Before reaching the side of the path, the second chipmunk tackled first with a headlong rush that sent the acorn flying. A squabble of legendary proportions ensued. The two little fellows squeaked and squealed and tumbled this way and that. Juliana was hard-pressed not to laugh out loud at all the commotion. Instead, she cleared her throat and asked in a motherly tone, "What, may I ask, is all this about?" The chipmunk stopped in mid-tussle and looked shyly up at her. Dree knelt to the ground and waited for an explanation. It came all at once from both of them, each accusing the other of stealing the acorn. Each became so adamant that they began to tussle once more. Juliana smiled and said, "Fellows, if you continue this ruckus, you may get more attention than you bargained for," and she pointed to the top of the pine tree. Talon had been watching the whole affair with great interest. When the chipmunks looked up, they froze in sudden terror, each afraid even to blink. There, Dree said kindly, "I'll make you a deal. If you both promise to share your acorn equally and stop squabbling, I'll talk to the hawk and ask him to hunt for his breakfast elsewhere this morning. Do we have a deal?" Almost before Juliana could blink, the chipmunks scrambled headlong to the base of a tree and into a well-hidden hole. They had forgotten all about the acorn. Dree chuckled to herself, picked it up, and placed it near the hole so the little ones could retrieve it later. Standing up and brushing herself off, Juliana looked up at Talon. He tilted his head and shrugged his shoulders slightly. She sighed softly as she headed down the path once more, feeling a little guilty over the fright she had given the chipmunks. Oh well, they needed to be taught a little lesson, or next time they mightn't be so lucky. A short time later, she reached the neighboring farm. She could hear the soft bleating of sheep and the sound of wood being cut as she grew nearer. Surrounded by pine trees and low fences, the Ole sheep farm was a wonderful place to visit. Juliana always loved to watch the baby's lambs romp and play, challenging each other to leaping games and headbutting each other till they knocked themselves silly. Today the Ole boys were each holding one end of a large saw, trying to cut through a very large log without much success. Tosh and Marvin Ole were as different as two brothers could be. Tosh, a year younger, at 17, was very tall and thin, with blonde hair and extremely light blue eyes. His skin was very fair and was burnt pink by the morning sun. Marvin, on the other hand, was short and stocky, with very dark features. His hair and eyes were as black as pitch. Marvin nodded and waved as Juliana walked by, puffing out his chest and standing up as straight as his short stature would allow. Tosh only blushed and turned his face away, too shy to wave. A second later, he was nearly pulled off his feet when Marvin pulled the saw hard, pointing at him and laughing out loud. Tosh blushed even deeper and growled at his brother. Mrs. Ole caught sight of the boys from behind the sheet she was hanging on the clothesline. "Get back to work, you two, before your father sees you goofing off," she scolded. Dree could see why the brothers were so different. Marvin looked and acted just like his mother, who was outgoing and friendly. Tosh was as shy and awkward as their father. As Mrs. Ole waved and called a very happy birthday to her, Mr. Ole stepped from the barn and carrying a milk bucket. He caught sight of the lovely young lady walking down the path and nearly spilled the milk. Excuse me. Blushing Despite himself, he could readily understand why his boys acted like fools whenever she was anywhere near. My goodness, she has grown into a vision, he thought to himself. After giving Dree a little wave, he headed straight for the house, before the missus caught him staring at the young girl. The Oldies were wonderful people, and Dree was fond of all of them. She had been playmates with the boys for years and really didn't understand why they looked at her so funny nowadays. This confused her, but Mama Bell had told her not to fret about it because it had something to do with them becoming young men. She kept walking, wondering what Mama Bell had meant. Tom and Peggy Cash's place was next along the path. The house was set close to the road on the right-hand side. They had just moved to the valley from the eastern forest area, so the house had a wonderful new look to it. Mr. Cash was busy working on a fence near the new barn. They had a lot to do to get their fields and livestock ready before the next winter set in. Peggy Cash, or Peg as she liked to be called, was sweeping her newly built porch when she noticed Drianna coming from a distance. She stopped and gave a hearty wave and hollered, "Hello!" Peg was a very large woman with shocking red hair that waved and curled in every direction. Her freckled complexion, sparkling green eyes, and laughing personality made it impossible not to like her. She was also as bold as she was big. She could give any man in the village a run for their money in everything from hunting to shoeing a horse. Dree thought she was a totally amazing woman. Thomas Cash was nothing like his wife. He was tall and quiet, barely spoke 2 words to anyone. He stayed pretty much to himself unless someone said anything about his Peggy. Then a charging grizzly bear was easier to stop than Tom Cash. Juliana had heard the older women of the village say that was the reason that the Cashes had to move to the village. Mama Bell did not hold well with gossip and had always told her not to believe half of what was said around town. Besides, Mr. Cash had always been pleasant to her and seemed to be a nice man. As Dree neared the house, a very large young man with a crop of red hair and a red face rounded the corner. He was half leading, half dragging a cantankerous mule behind him. He bellowed and cursed the animal loudly. Then he swung the lead rope and hit the poor creature soundly across the neck. Juliana's breath caught in her throat and a cold shiver ran down her spine. Otto Cash was the last person she wanted to see at that moment. Tom and Peggy Cash's son was 18 years old, was bigger, broader, and meaner than any man Juliana had ever met. His behavior disturbed and appalled her. It seemed he was always trying to prove how tough he was, not caring who or what he hurt in the process. Dree had decided from the start to stay as far away from Otto Cash as she possibly could. But of late, that seemed to be getting harder to do. He was always making rude comments and gestures toward her, which made her feel uncomfortable, to say the least. Shaking off the disturbing thoughts that came to her mind, Juliana smiled politely and waved to Mrs. Cash. Running her hand down the new fence that had been put up near the roadside, Juliana stopped just for a moment and whinnied softly. The mule's large ears turned ever so slightly at the sound. Juliana noticed Otto bending over to pick up the yoke and harness lying on the ground near the porch. A sly smile crossed her lips, and she whinnied again. A moment later, Juliana heard heard Otto's howl in pain as large square teeth chomped on soft flesh. She had to cover her mouth with her hand to stop a hearty laugh from escaping. Serves him right, she thought. She walked on down the path with a bit more pep in her step, swinging her basket delightedly. Chapter 3. Dolan. The path curved gently, and as Dree rounded the bend, it widened and opened into a large clearing. The village of Dolan opened up before her with the sound of children's laughter. The two younger Anderson girls, Sierra and Eva, ran by carrying rag dolls, while their older sister Loretta followed behind them with her face buried in a book. A rambunctious puppy bounced along beside them, yapping happily. The village was small, but full of life. The general store was the first building on the left. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson stood on the porch with Charles Carpenter, the dairy farmer. They were hashing out a price for the produce that overflowed from a wagon parked alongside the building. The livery was across the street, with the blacksmith shop just beyond it. As Juliana passed the store, Mrs. Anderson stopped talking long enough to wave and wish her a happy birthday. Then she turned back and began to chatter happily about how beautiful Dree looked today and how her Mama Belle had made her dress and so on and so on. Mr. Anderson just shook his head because it seemed that Mr. Carpenter had lost his sense of hearing as his eyes followed Dree's back. Across the street, two lively young horses pranced and played in one of the three small corrals that were attached to the livery barn. Juliana couldn't help walking over to the fence to watch. She knew they were playing the I Can Do It Better game. She watched the pair prance and dance around the ring. Manes and tails flew like banners of kings as they passed her. She applauded their efforts with a bright smile and a gleeful laugh. The horses raised their heads a bit higher at her approval. "Ain't they pretty, Miss Dree?" came a small, sweet voice at Driana's elbow. "Yes, they certainly are," she said as she looked down at two angelic faces. Dorian Parsons was dutifully holding the hand of his little sister Deshana, or Dee Dee, as her big brother called her. Their mother had allowed him to bring his sister from their house down the street so she could see the horses. Dorian was 8 years old and took his big brother job very seriously. Dee Dee was only 6 years old and needed to be looked after. The children had known Miss Dree all their lives and loved her very much. The barn door opened suddenly, and the livery owner, Mr. Otterman, stepped through leading a very skittish filly. The elderly man was doing his best to comfort the horse by talking gently to her. He hooked his walking cane over his elbow and reached up to pet her neck. She lurched backward, ears flattened and eyes wide. "Come on, girl, what's wrong with ya?" he said in a worried voice. "Mr. Otterman," Driana called, "put down your cane and back away from her." The old man looked at Driana doubtfully, but did what she asked. The horse quieted and stood docilely as Mr. Otterman walked over to where Dree and the children stood. "Well, I'll be," he said, running his fingers through his thinning hair. "So tell me, lass, what's the filly's trouble?" Triana smiled. Mr. Otterman was a gentle soul and loved all creatures just as she did. He lived in a small room in the back of the stable, so he could always be close to the animals he cared for. Although he couldn't speak to them the way she did, he had a way about him that all animals seemed to respect. "She's afraid of your cane, sir," Driana explained. "She She says her last owner beat her harshly with a riding crop. She knows you're a nice man, but the cane frightens her. Mr. Ottoman held up his hand as if to say, I understand, and walked back to the horse. With gentle hands and soothing voice, he led her to an empty corral and let her go, leaving the cane where it lay. The filly trotted around the ring once and came back to nuzzle the old man's hand. That's her way of saying thank you, Dree explained to the children still standing at her side. Mrs. Parsons called the children away a moment later. With a bye-bye, Miss Dree, they ran off, still holding hands. Juliana watched as Mr. Ottoman gave the filly and the other horses a carrot and a gentle pat before he went back to work in the barn. He waved us a goodbye as she walked away. Further down the street, the sound of metal on metal began to ring out loudly. Mr. Oakley, a giant of a man, was beating hot metal into horseshoes. He was not only the blacksmith of Dolan, he was also the town founder and leader. He and his family had been the first to settle in this area and had named the village Dolan after his firstborn son. The child had died at an early age, but Mr. Oakley said the town kept his memory alive. As he beat the metal in a rhythm only a true craftsman would have, his young son, Jared, worked the bellows. At 14, Jared was small for his age, but he worked hard beside his father. He was proud to be the son of Amos Oakley, and his father was equally as proud of him. They lived alone in a house behind the shop. Mrs. Oakley had died of fever only a few years after Jared was born. As Dree walked down the street, listening to the sound of hammer and anvil and the whoosh of the bellows, she had to admire the beautiful music it all made. Miss Cora called a yoo-hoo from down the street. Her little boarding house inn stood a little way back from the main square, set in the middle of a small poplar grove. Its white picket fence and pink shutters gave a quaint feeling. The window boxes full of brightly colored flowers and the flowers that lined the walkway only added to the fairy tale look. Miss Cora Draper was one of the sweetest ladies Dree had ever known. Somewhere in her 70s, Cora was short and plump, with snow-white hair braided around her head. Her rosy cheeks, twinkling eyes, and ready smile greeted everyone who came to her little inn. Drianna smiled and waved to the old woman as she continued to walk. Miss Cora hollered, "Yoo-hoo!" once again and motioned Dree to her. As she approached the porch, Mrs. Cora's excitement grew. She practically danced to the bottom of the stairs. "Happy birthday, my sweet child," she sang. "How beautiful you look today. I have something for you, and I just can't wait until later." "Oh, please wait right here," the old woman said as she flew up the stairs and into the house. A moment later, she returned with a little box wrapped with a yellow ribbon. Handing the package to Drianna, Miss Cora announced proudly, "I made it myself." Dree accepted the package with quiet thank you and opened it slowly. Miss Cora's entire body bounced with anticipation. Inside, Drianna found the most delicate little handkerchief she had ever seen. It was made of white lace and embroidered with perfect little rosebuds, each with tiny green leaves and stems. Along the bottom edge, Drianna's name had been embroidered into the lace in such a way that it looked like it was part of it. Dree couldn't believe how beautiful the little hanky was. She reached out and gave Miss Cora a gentle squeeze and a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you so much, Miss Cora. I will treasure it always. It's beautiful," she said softly. The old woman beamed at Driana's praise. "Beauty belongs with beauty, my child," she said sweetly, patting the girl's cheek gently. "Now where are you off to this glorious morning?" she asked, reaching for her broom and leaned against the porch rail. "Mama Bell sent me to pick flowers in the meadow. She wants some for the party this afternoon. Well, shoot, child. Get on your way. You don't want to keep your Mama Bell waiting." Miss Cora gently swatted Driana's bottom with her broom. They both giggled like children as Dree skipped away. The Parsons house was just across the street. Mr. Parsons was a cabinet maker and wheelwright by trade. Mrs. Parsons waved to her from the porch as she watched the children play tag in the yard. The village square ended there. The little road continued north to parts unknown, places she had never been and really didn't want to go. Dolan was her home and her life, and that made her very happy. She knew of only 2 other families that lived anywhere near the village, and they were the Thomases, who lived on the other side of the meadow, and of course the Carpenters, whose farm was several miles to the south of her home. He and his wife, Honey, had 2 children, which brought the total of folks in Dolan to 27. Driana thought of all of them as her family and loved them all very much. She turned toward a small patch of woods. The meadow was just beyond it. Driana had just reached the beginning of the path leading to the meadow when she was stopped by the sound of horse hoofs. She turned to see Mr. Ottoman leading the 3 horses from the livery toward the grassy area on the other side of Miss Cora's house. Mr. Ottoman tipped his hat and waved to Miss Cora as he passed. Driana could almost see Miss Cora's blush from where she stood. She also noticed the strange look cross Mrs. Parsons' face as she gathered the children up and led them into the house. The women of the village had gossiped many times of how old Mr. Ottoman was sweet on Miss Cora, and how improper it all was at their age. Driana could hear Miss Cora scoff about the utter nonsense of it all and say something like, "Those hens need to peck around someone else's yard." Driana giggled to herself and headed down the little path, swinging her basket at her side. Reaching the meadow a few moments later, Dree's eyes took in the view. The meadow was alive with color. Soft pinks and yellows mingled with brilliant red and purples, splashes of blue and white interlaced with several hues of green. Butterflies floated over delicate petals while grasshoppers jumped from stem to stem. A gentle breeze blew, bringing the sweet scent that tickled Driana's nose. A feeling of utter peace and contentment filled her heart and soul. Not wanting to spoil the meadow's beauty, she took careful steps and was very gentle as she picked the flowers she selected and placed them carefully in her basket. As she wandered through the flowers, she noticed a tiny line of smoke rising up through the trees. The widow Thomas must be making bread, she thought to herself. The Thomases had settled a small farm about 3 miles into the woods. Cordell Thomas had been killed in a tragic accident some years ago when a tree he had been cutting fell the wrong way and crushed him beneath it. Mrs. Thomas, a very frail woman, now depended on their only son, Devlin, to help maintain the farm. Thinking of Devlin made Driana's heart skip a beat. Tall and dark, with brilliant blue eyes, Devlin Thomas made every woman, young and old, swoon at the sight of him. But what Dree admired most about him was that he didn't seem to notice this fact at all. He was totally devoted to his mother's care. On the rare occasion when he came to town, he doted on her. He was totally oblivious to the stares and giggles from the women and girls who saw him. Juliana felt a blush rise to her cheeks as she remembered the one time he looked at her and smiled. She was still amazed at how a simple smile could make her feel all watery inside. Dree scoffed a little at herself and wondered what Mama Bell would have said about it if she had had the nerve to tell her. The thought of Mama Bell brought a sudden feeling of sadness. She had seen the look on the old woman's face when she had left the house and what it was for. She smiled a little as she thought of her Mama and Papa. She had known for some time now that they were not her real family, for even though no human in the village had told her, the animals were not as good at keeping secrets. A very nosy magpie had to tell her how she had come to live in Dolan. Dree shook her head and smiled. It didn't matter at all, although she wondered from time to time who her real parents were and what could have happened to them. She loved Mama Bell and Papa Colin with all her heart, and nothing would ever change that. Juliana's pleasant thoughts were shattered just then by a cock's warning shriek. The warning came too late. As a dark shadow covered the sun and a black mass swooped down on her, massive claws wrapped around Juliana's body and began lifting her from the ground. A scream died in Juliana's throat as darkness surrounded her. The basket of flowers fell to the ground, and the delicate hanky she had been holding fluttered down to lie on top of it. Juliana fainted at that moment, oblivious to the pounding of giant